Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Shout Communications, or more precisely, welcome to my living room in Ealing, as Shout Communications is open for business, but we're all obviously working from home. So thank you, everybody, for joining us for our workshop. So you might have been to one of our workshops before. We generally hold them in our radio studio or offices in Bloomsbury. But for the foreseeable future, we've decided to move them onto a webinar platform, and I think this is our third or fourth one. So welcome along. Like our workshops, we say that let's be quite informal. Feel free to ask a question. I shall do my best with the technology. This is only the second one I've done, and I shall try to answer you if you send me a little message. But to be telling you what we're going to be doing for the next hour, or could be 45 minutes, depends if you chip in with questions, really. So we'll be looking at ways that, this course is called 10 Steps to Broadcast PR Heaven. We've added in coronavirus hell because that brings with it the challenges, but we will still be talking through the workshop as we would normally do about the mainstream ways really to get coverage on air, whether it's radio, television, or online with video production. So I'll be basically whizzing through those four things. A little bit about spokespeople too, how to make the most of an opportunity with your perfect spokesperson. But as I say, feel free to ask a question if you want to. But first of all, the elephant in the room, is it an elephant? I don't know. Coronavirus, because people have phoned up and sometimes have been surprised when we've answered the phone and said, "Oh, didn't realise you're still working." Meaning, are we still getting coverage? Yes, we are. Is the answer to that? It is really challenging because obviously radio and television, but I would say television in particular, is more or less wall to wall with coronavirus. But there comes a point in every big story. I mean, it happens when it's terrorism, it happened with Brexit, it happens when there's a big death, that at some point broadcasters and their audiences start to get what we would call story fatigue. And I speak as a former broadcast journalist myself. I'm ex-BBC, ITN, Sky some years ago, but the old ways stick with you. And I would say that you do reach a point where actually we do need to still know about COVID-19. We need to know what the latest developments are, but actually we need a little reminder too of what is normal. So there is this appetite for other stories too, and especially if the story has some sort of ideally good feel to COVID-19. And so we've adapted this workshop a little bit to try to accommodate the current situation. But we have 10 steps. And the first one is, we think that there's a better chance of coverage when you're speaking to journalists if you think like a broadcast journalist. And we feel qualified to do that because myself and most of the team come from that world. And how broadcast journalists think at the moment is, some of them have been around a long time, and they remember when there were 4 channels. Now, of course, we've got these multiple platforms and so many channels you can't even sometimes name them all. But the interesting thing, I think, when you think about this is that, yes, we have a lot of choice with what we watch and what we listen to, but the audience remains the same size as it's ever been. It's just spread more thinly. And so broadcasters are very conscious about this, and they're thinking it's so easy for us to pick up a remote and change channels. How are they going to keep our attention and to stop us flicking over to the competition? So most of broadcast PR opportunities are on news or sometimes daytime programming, things like This Morning or Loose Women, that sort of thing. But most of the opportunities that you get through broadcast come on news. And they say that news used to be made up of those 3 things: information, education, and entertainment. And I would say over the years, and since the years I was a journalist and the time I've worked in PR, that whole thing about information has been eroded. You get a little bit of information, but think about a national television package. It lasts about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, 3 words to a second. You're not imparting that much information. Education. Well, we've had a bit of a rush, haven't we, with education stories about washing our hands and how to stay safe from coronavirus. But I think that's noticeable for its rarity, really, because over the years news has become less and less about that. And what I think broadcast news is primarily about is entertainment, and not funny but entertainment as in content that engages and makes an audience want to stay listening or tuned into a particular broadcast. So when you're a journalist, and years ago I used to be a news editor at ITN, so you'd see all these stories coming in. I was probably quite a horrible journalist because I'd answer the phone and would give you short shrift if you're trying to flog me a PR story. And you're thinking, why would we want this story? That's really the mindset of a journalist, because journalists always want something that's new. And a cynical journalist might say, well, there's no such thing as a news story. In that case, they want a new twist on an old story. We used to talk about it as pub stories when I worked at ITN. Sometimes people talk about it as water cooler stories. And it's that hallmark of a story that is so good, so engaging, that the audience remembers it. And so when you go home, you say to your partner or your flatmate, oh, did you hear about such and such a thing? Did you hear about the old guy, who raised £30 million for the NHS? That's the sort of really perfect story that really sets the imagination alight. But broadcast wants things that are going to be relevant to the audience, and that's because broadcast is broad in name, but broad in nature. It's trying to encompass most times the biggest audience possible, and so it's trying to make stories relevant to that audience in order to keep them interested. And maybe we're just all a bit selfish in our habits. We find things more interesting if we can relate it back to you, and so that is a technique that broadcasters use to try to keep their audience interested. And these days, as I've slightly alluded to in the first slide, they're looking for lighter stories with a link to coronavirus. And I've got a couple of examples later on. I've put it at the end of the course in case there's people on this webinar that have joined in our previous webinars too. But to illustrate the sorts of things that work. But, something about how to stay motivated at home or keep fit within the current rules. Those are all the sorts of things that we would consider to have a link to the pandemic, and to be of interest as a slightly alternative story for broadcasters at the moment. And then step 2, think timing. So broadcasts are obsessed by time, and it's funny, when you've worked in broadcast, that just becomes part of your DNA then, about I can never personally be late for anything. If I say something's going to be done for a particular time, it absolutely will be. And that's what broadcasters are doing. And that's because broadcasters always used to think that they were first with the news, and then along came online, and now broadcasters really vie with online to try to be the most immediate medium. And online, often news can break online, and it just needs to be a little bit of copy. But with broadcasts, it's all the logistics of either getting pictures on air or getting an interview on air that makes it that much trickier to keep up with online. Without question, and this applies now, it's always applied, that broadcast needs to come before the newspapers. If it's a half decent story, then broadcasters will say, well, it's okay if it's the same day, then it's in print and it's on air too, but certainly not the day afterwards. Breakfast news and mid-mornings, they're always going to be more receptive to a PR story than news bulletins later on in the day, when you've got more organic news to compete with. And that's why we would always embargo our stories, and we'll embargo them till a minute past midnight, and that means they can be picked up through the night in time for breakfast news. And radio in particular has some of the highest audience figures for breakfast news, but it's also for things like BBC Breakfast or Sunrise on Sky, that sort of thing. The other thing that I put under the category of timing is all the planning meetings that broadcast have. And we always think that the earlier that you manage to get a story on a planning meeting, the more the more successful you're likely to be. And sometimes we do sell in stories and we've had a day or 2 days notice, but for most PR stories, which let's face it are not always the must-have stories of the day, your best chance comes if you can manage to get that onto a weekly meeting, so then that's there on the list for the day before and the on the day, and then when you're on the day, it's whether the story comes below the line, which means they think it's a good story but they haven't got enough space for it, or above the line, which means it is actually in the running order and it is going to go out on air. And we always say with broadcast, you've got to hold your nerve, because national broadcasters particularly aren't going to make a decision until sometimes even on the day. And I think with all this coverage of coronavirus, that the last minute decisions are even more prominent than they were before. But with those last minute changes and stories being dropped, there are also last minute opportunities as well. So I always think out of bad, some good will always come. And I think if you've got spokespeople who are prepared to be a little bit flexible, hopefully they are safely at home. They don't have to go far these days to do an interview. It's just by Skype or by landline most often. Then those opportunities are sometimes there for the taking. And we say talk their language. So every industry's got its own vocabulary, hasn't it? And broadcast is no different. And I think if you sound vaguely that you know what you're talking about, then a broadcaster is going to be a bit more open-minded to your approach, I suppose. And I could have filled this slide up several times over with different things. So we've just picked out a couple of examples. And I think understanding the difference between input and output, for example, in broadcast is quite an interesting one, particularly in terms of people to target. So imagine a newsroom and imagine a line dividing that room, and on one side you've got people working on input and the other side output. So input, that's everybody who works on planning. It's producers who quite often at national level work with correspondents and editors to actually gather together some of the material that is going to end up on TV. So some of the producers might go and do interviews, for example, or in the days when they were allowed to go out and do filming, they might go out with a cameraman and get that footage in. So they're all the ones that they would come under news gathering, whereas the people on the output side, they're the ones that are in the newsroom all the time. They're working with the news editors who are making the logistics happen, but the people outputting are actually outputting the programme. And so they'll be fine-tuning things, they'll be making sure that stories have come in time for a bulletin, they'll be writing the cues for the newsreader to read and that sort of thing. So as PRs, we don't often really talk to people on output. It's only if there's been a huge gaffe that's gone out on air, or the wrong name, or a huge error, and you might then want to speak to people on output in order to get them to put that right in a future bulletin. But for most standard stories, it's people working on the input side that are the most interesting. We have a lot of editors as well in broadcast. I've put a few of them there. So executive editors up there at the top, they're sometimes called executive producers, but they've got programme editors. So they'll be the ones that really have the last say in what stories are going to go in a bulletin. A news editor will make that happen. They're in charge of the news desk. And they will work together with the programme editors, making sure that the interviews come in, that the stories are updated, that the stories are correct, but they're really working to the tune of the programme editors. And then VT editors, which is a slightly old-fashioned term now because it really stands for videotape editors, and of course we don't work on videotape anymore, we work digitally, but they're the ones who chop it together. Sometimes it's a reporter that chops it together, but more often, particularly at national level, it will be an editor. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of the sort of thing I'm talking about. The other thing where we think that broadcast is quite different from print in our approach as PRs is with broadcast releases. So we're so often working with an agency or an in-house comms team, and they might be doing the print and online coverage, and we're doing the broadcast, and we say, well, can we see your press release? And it'll be 5 or 6 pages long, and we will rewrite it in a broadcast friendly way, by which we mean we'll slash it, 5 of those 6 pages will go, and we will write it in a very brief way. We'll do a headline, but the headline's only really an attention grabber. It's never going to go out on air, but it's just something to get people reading. It will be written in a cue style. And sometimes when we do radio days, we've got back-to-back live radio interviews, we will hear that same cue that we've written going out again and again, because we've written it so that it can be spoken out loud rather than written to be read. If you don't know quite what I mean, have a go at doing something. It's like writing down what you're saying rather than writing in a more formal way. So it's more colloquial, more informal. The sentences are short. If you have to draw breath, then the sentence is probably too long. And we'll put talking points in. We'll never put quotes in, but we'll give an indication about what a spokesperson might say. And if we're selling into television, it's saying what can be filmed. This is back in the real world, but these days we would be saying a little bit of what can be filmed, because sometimes a broadcaster will go out for a bigger story. They are still taking some crews if they can justify it. But for example, we're doing something for a client at the moment, and we're managing to do little bits of filming at home. It is a story about working from home, so we're managing to do little bits there. But otherwise, you know, who's available to be interviewed. In non-coronavirus times, I'd be talking about logistics and how it's good to have somebody in London and somebody in Manchester because of BBC Breakfast and 5 Live. But these days, everybody is being interviewed by Skype, so it kind of doesn't matter where they are, really. And then contact details, of course, which I'm sure you do anyway. So who's our perfect spokesperson then? So I would say we've sort of written it in the order of importance there. Willing and available gets you the opportunities. Even a bad spokesperson could get more opportunities by being willing and available. And as we were saying, it's easy now, isn't it? It's just get the internet or have a landline to do that. But with broadcast, it has been flexible about the time, particularly if it's a brand that's perhaps not new or not very well known. Perhaps your first opportunities might come very late at night or very early in the morning. We have had a new brand recently, and we got them on LBC, but it was about 5 o'clock in the morning. And they were going, well, who's listening at 5 o'clock in the morning? Well, some people are listening, not as many people as are listening at 7 o'clock, but quite often producers are listening and other journalists are listening too. So you're not just talking about that audience at that particular time, you're thinking, do a good show, and actually other journalists might pick up on the interview you've done, and you know, next time round you're more likely to be mid-morning or breakfast shows. So that willing and availability, I think that gets you a lot of goodwill. I mentioned the word entertainment before, and for a spokesperson to be a perfect spokesperson or even a very good spokesperson, they need to be entertaining. I don't mean telling jokes, I mean the sort of person who can engage and enthuse and really appreciate that when they're doing a broadcast interview, that they're in quite a, I suppose, privileged position. It's a hard-won opportunity, and they're in the spotlight. Sometimes it's really short. Sometimes it can only be a couple of minutes with a live interview. But for those couple of minutes, they do need to be able to perform. And sometimes the issue is, particularly with something like a radio day, where you might get 15, 20 interviews. We had one the other week, and it was 34 interviews. To enthuse at interview number 34 as much as you enthused at interview number 1 and 2, that's quite difficult to do. It's possible, but sometimes the spokesperson needs a little bit of reminding, and you know, it's remembering that it's a fresh opportunity every time you do an interview. And they need an opinion, and they need to be able to express that opinion with authority. And it comes back to this whole thing about being engaging and entertaining again. Broadcasters like to say there's somebody on this side and there's somebody on that side, and they've got opposing views and they clash. And that's what makes entertaining broadcasting. If everybody agreed, that's a bit dull. If people clash, that's more interesting. It's more entertaining, it's more engaging. People are less likely to turn it over the channels. And they need to be presentable, but presentable for the brand that they represent. So if you worked for, I don't know, a charity or perhaps a new startup, you might be more casual than if you worked for a FTSE 100 company, where the expectation, a lot of it does come down to expectation of the brand you represent. The expectation would be that you would be suited and booted, and you will be a polished performer. Years ago, when I was a journalist, I think it was a minority of people that were media trained. But I think such are the opportunities now that there is really an expectation from the broadcasters, as much as anything, that people will be polished, that they will be able to give a good answer, whether it's a pre-recorded interview or live, that they'll be able to stand their ground, and that they will be able to give that good, engaging, entertaining contribution to their programme. I think few of us are born as natural broadcasters. Most of us have got to practice, and that's quite often what it is. Sometimes it's just about confidence, but to practice in order to do that, and to remember that when you're doing a broadcast interview, there's kind of two sides to it. One side is giving the journalists what they want, but the other side is obviously to remember why you're there. So whether that's branding or communicating key messages. And it's the marriage of these two things that makes for a successful interview. Sometimes, however, the perfect spokesperson is not your corporate spokesperson, it's somebody else. So it could be a celebrity ambassador, it could be a third party, Dr. I haven't got my glasses on, but I think that's Dr. Hillary there. It could be an expert or a psychologist, an academic. And that always works really well for broadcast, because broadcasters are very wary about a story being too much of an advert. And BBC, they've got their producer guidelines book to adhere to, a whole load of rules, it's about that thick. And if you work on the commercial sector, then you've got advertisers to answer to. And so, you know, if somebody's paying £250,000 to advertise on TV, they're going to wonder why somebody's getting a free advert on the news. So it's a sort of it's a fine line, and I will talk about branding in a moment, but you've got to be able to sort of meld those two things together. If spokespeople is something that you're really interested in knowing about, we do a course using celebrities and third parties. So have a look on our website if you're interested in coming on that course or webinar, and you can see. Now, I've just talked, and two people have written messages. Oh, it's my colleague Catherine saying that Dr. Hillary, who she used to work with actually at Good Morning Britain, a fantastic brand ambassador and great to work with. And I would support that view. Yes, yes, I would. He is. For a while, Nationals used to be a bit funny about on BBC about using him because he was so associated with GMB. But BBC regional, BBC stations don't seem to have that dilemma, and we would say he's a really good person to use for a health story. So when you want television, the first thing a television journalist used to say was, well, what can we film? Because television's obviously all about the visuals. And we would say even in a pandemic where nobody's going out easily to film, you still need to think about the pictures. And I think never has there been a better time to think about trying to get together a B-roll. And a B-roll, for anybody who's not quite sure, we would call B-roll, we've put 5 to 10 minutes there. Yeah, it could be. Most B-rolls I've ever done, sort of 7 to 8 minutes of roughly edited pictures that illustrate a PR story. So they would be filmed by a PR agency like Shout. And they'd be roughly edited together. So if you watch it, it is a bit like watching paint drying. It's not interesting or polished or finished. But what it does look like is something that news broadcasters might have filmed for themselves. And that's the perfect thing, isn't it? Because broadcasters don't really want to use somebody else's pictures. But they are, newsrooms have suffered cutbacks for many years now, and because they're under-resourced, if you have produced some footage that looks something like they would have filmed for themselves, then they're more likely to use it. And certainly, I used to be a news editor, and if I was sitting there judging between two PR stories, and one came with pictures and the other one didn't, you're definitely going to go for the one with pictures. But we say that there's two golden rules for getting a B-roll used, because you're going to be spending a few £1,000s in order to produce a B-roll, and you obviously want to get value for money from it. And so the first rule is shoot it in a new style. And by this, I mean nothing too glossy. It can't look like an advert. The finished product probably needs to have a selection of shots that you'll have a couple of wide shots, a couple of medium shots, a couple of close-up shots too. If the camera moves, so if it pans, which is when a camera sort of moves from left to right or the other way around, that shot would be quite quick, and it would be following something. You know, maybe it's a car moving, an animal moving, or something. You're not going to move the camera just because it makes a pretty arty shot, because that's not really a new style. And then the second thing, which I think is really easy to do in this current situation, is to give broadcasters something that they can't easily film for themselves. So sometimes in pre-coronavirus, that's been perhaps something that's taken a long time to do, or something when it's national news is outside of London. Perhaps it's something that needs to be shot at night. There's all sorts of things. And of course now broadcasters are more restricted than ever. And so if you've got B-roll, even if it's a little bit dusty, get it off the shelf. We're always happy to look at B-roll to say whether it would work or not, and get creative. And there's probably stuff that you can do. I've put there that stills are a last resort, which they really are, because broadcast is obviously all about moving pictures, but sometimes you can animate stills to make them better. And just in the way that broadcasters have decided that sound quality level standards have gone down a little bit, well, I think so possibly, arguably, has the standard of pictures that if it's a story that they really want and it's stills rather than moving pictures, there's a bit more compromise involved than there used to be. And think sound too. So 6 weeks ago, I'd have said broadcasters want studio quality interview because it sounds better. These days, of course, no broadcasters are having guests in, and we're all confined to our homes. So this is how we're doing radio days at the moment. Predominantly, we're doing them on Skype or FaceTime. If the internet connection, for whatever reason, isn't very good, then landline is your second choice. And mobile really is the last resort, just because of the broken calls and the quality of the sound isn't so good. We're still pre-recording audio. Sometimes it's a podcast as part of a radio day, and sometimes we record podcasts just as standalone podcasts. And what we do with this is we record them on something like Zoom, and our sound engineer will make sure it's recorded our end, and we will ask the people doing the interviews to record on their mobile phones as well, so on something like voice notes, because again the quality of the sound is better than the quality of the sound on Zoom. And then they send over the audio file from Zoom Notes, and our sound engineer, using their own recording as a guide, will then edit the voice notes together. And then having that Zoom recording there as well is a sort of backup too, just in case anybody thinks they're recording on voice notes and they haven't done after all. So that's all working pretty well, I would say, for news and radio programming. And in terms of producing, you can still do that remotely from home by email or text. We allow a bit more time between interviews. Instead of doing back-to-back every 10 minutes, we're probably doing more like every 15 minutes, just to give that breathing space for that communication. But really, and quite effectively, radio interviews are happening from the world of PR pretty well. So I say that's still something to consider. So case studies, particularly beloved by radio, but really beloved by TV, because for both mediums, case studies bring story to life. They make it more relevant to the audience. And I said at the beginning, that's what broadcasters want, but they've got to be relevant to the story. So I think we've got somebody, I think this is a health story we've got up there. So it's really got to be somebody that has experienced that condition, or potentially somebody really, really close to somebody who's perhaps passed away from it. That's what I mean about relevance, because it's got to be somebody who can speak from the heart to make it work for broadcast. Never, ever, ever can you have the comms director or somebody from an agency posing as a case study. That's where broadcasters will lose their rag. And I kind of agree with them, really. There's got to be that credibility, that authenticity about a case study. London and beyond, that means have one in London because you want national coverage. But it's good to have one outside London too, because national broadcasters are quite often accused of being too London-centric. So to have a case study out of London doesn't mean to say it's not going to be used by nationals. Ideally, you might have one in Manchester, because then that's really helpful for BBC Breakfast, or not too far from Manchester. But wherever you've got case studies, if you're doing radio and television, we would always get coverage for that case study, and wherever in the country they are, if it's not used nationally, we would get the case studies used regionally. And again, they've got to be willing and available, and so that's part of the job, isn't it, to brief the case studies so that they know that broadcast can start early in the morning. If it's live interview, are they willing to do that? In more normal times, are they agreeable to allow a camera crew to come into their houses? And camera crews are quite dreadful. They think nothing of saying, oh, we'll just move the sofa over there and then we'll film this and we'll do that. They do normally put it back together again, but if you've got perhaps an older person, maybe they find that a little bit too much, whereas if they're briefed about it, they might be more receptive to it. And to keep them on messaging. We've had it particularly with health stories before, where case studies have talked about a different drug from the one that we're actually promoting on air, and other gaffes too. I'm sure we could write a book about it. But I know they're difficult to get, case studies, but they are really valuable and should bear fruit if you manage to get them. So we've talked about radio, we've talked about television, and just to talk briefly, I suppose, about online video, which I really like in terms of giving a return to a client for their investment, because broadcast is very much have a story on a particular day, and if suddenly it's a really busy day, a lot of stories get blown out, and unlike print, where the newspaper just gets a bit thicker, more pages on a website, broadcast is much more rigid. If you've got a half-hour news bulletin, which is what most of them are, it would take something like a royal death or something for that programme to be extended. Whereas with online video, big demand for online video, and once it's up there, isn't it? It gives that longevity that marvellous, though I will say broadcast PR is, that it doesn't have that same longevity. You can be more specific for audiences as well, of course, and it works we found it's worked on both a local and a national level. It has changed, though. I think their standards have become more akin to radio and TV. So in terms of finding something perhaps too commercial, used to get away with more online, and now I think actually you're getting away with less. And the competition really is really from websites, particularly newspaper websites, wanting to take more about TV clips and celebrities. So I think it's that thing, a bit of celebrity sparkle gets you a long way, and with celebrities might get you more online, where without a celebrity that story might not have worked. We've got a little example there, which if you'd been in our office, we would have played. I'm not quite up to that technically yet on this webinar, but it was to do with the World Cricket competition last year in Manchester. And you've got people from Love Island plus a whole load of cricketers, and it was an example that worked really well, but it was the celebiness of it that got the coverage. I'm croaking a little bit, excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water before talking about regional. So regional radio, I've slightly alluded to a little bit. We haven't talked about regional television though, which I sometimes think is a medium that gets overlooked, and it shouldn't be, because actually what's happened with regional television, and you can sort of see on the map we've got up there, that actually regional television can cover huge swathes of the country, and it can be as logistically challenging as national TV to actually get the coverage for, because they need to make themselves different. So it's the same as local radio, that you need the local angles, the local stats. Quite often you might only have a national spokesperson, but regional TV will be saying, have you got a regional one too? And if you can manage to get that together, you will get more coverage. And you do get hundreds of thousands of people watching one particular regional TV station. And that's because a lot of the regional TV stations have amalgamated. And so what used to be 3 or 4 different broadcasters has now come together as one, so really boosting the audience. Sometimes you can get one national spokesperson in London. BBC has dropped it at the moment, but ITV is still doing it, that they have a service which works a little bit like Sky Radio, that there's one interview and it gets syndicated to all the regional TV stations. So again, that's a really fantastic boost to anybody's campaign, should you be successful with it, which we sometimes are. So I talked about branding, I referred to branding before, and less is more. I think that's the most important thing to do. So, you know, it's a deal, isn't it, with broadcasters and the media, that we can't just produce these stories and get nothing in return, otherwise we're not going to have any clients. We can't overdo it for the reasons I said before, that BBC's got its rules, and commercials have got their rules really set by advertisers. And so it's how much is too much. So we always say with broadcasting, if you get one brand mentioned visually or audibly, that is a successful interview. And it might only be up there for 10 seconds as a Aston, that's the words on the screen. But that's on national television with the huge audiences that you get with national television. If you get 2, that's acceptable, and 3 is probably the limit, because when you do broadcast, you don't just want to be on broadcast once. You want the brand, the spokesperson, to be invited back again and again. And if you're going to go off as an advert, then people will, journalists will put you in the black book. They do really have black books. They have books where they put people they want back, and then they've got another list of names of people they won't have back too. But you can see our examples there. So Chris Packham, who's in the green T-shirt, they're calling him wildlife presenter, but they've allowed him to wear his T-shirt because it's fairly subtle. Maybe it's a little bit because it's Chris Packham as well. And then our cricketer in the shot below, that's the logo for the World Cricket Competition, and that's okay too. But anymore, and no, you wouldn't get away with it. A few years ago, there was a really ridiculous thing where people were trying to get away with more and more. So somebody would wear a hat, it'd have a logo there, and the journalist will just say, well, you know, take it off. As a journalist myself, I've said to somebody, if you haven't got another T-shirt, or you can't turn it inside out, we can't do it, because it was too blatant. And then this ridiculous situation where people were having those T-shirts with collars and putting a logo on the collar. And so what Sky were particularly bad for this, that instead of doing this is the sort of frame that you would normally get for news when you see somebody sort of head and shoulders, and it got tighter and tighter in order to squeeze out the logo on the collar. So don't think you can get one past the broadcast journalist, you're not going to be able to. And technical support, well, this is all being put on the shelf for the time being. But why I've left it in here is because eventually we will come out of this situation and we will go back to some sort of normal where hopefully we can become as helpful to journalists as we possibly can in order to get as much coverage as we can. And you know, sometimes some of those things are helpful for broadcasters. OB's at the top, outside broadcast. So this is sometimes helping facilitate an interview on location, so that a broadcaster, either the reporter or a reporter sending pictures, can get footage back. And for radio, it's nice to have a sort of different sound background. That it's all very well having people in a studio, but sometimes it's nice to have that sort of audio tapestry in the background that can create an atmosphere to a story too. So I would say, out of all those things, that's probably the most useful. Although over the years, we've been going for 17 years, we have used and offered all those things to clients as we go along. So I've whizzed through our 10 steps in order to give you a couple of examples of things that have worked. And apologies if anybody's been on the previous webinars. We did have one which was just all about case studies in the webinar, and we were showing what had worked. And really, we were sort of going, we were just sort of learning by our own experience, trying our best to make things work, and being quite surprised with some of the results. So to begin with, this is Ordnance Survey, who do the maps and the remote get around things, and they were having Go Outside Day, which was something that they've done on an annual basis. And this was just around about the time we'd been into lockdown for a couple of weeks. So you think that was a no-go, but it became National Get Outside Inside Day. And it became a record-breaking event about how to, it's about doing exercise indoors. The record-breaking thing was how many people could all be stepping simultaneously. It could be grandparents just stepping on the spot, or it could be kids running up and down stairs. It appealed to broadcasters because it was light, it was on message with everything the government was saying about staying at home, but trying to stay active too. And the results speak for itself. 32 interviews would be really good by anyone's standard at any time. And this was the day after Boris Johnson, it had been announced that he was in intensive care, and he was still in intensive care. So despite all the coverage by that, we did manage to do that. But I think we were lucky to a point in that that was a really good fit for the moment, which is feel good stories that tie in with coronavirus, but are different as well. And I appreciate not all stories are like that, but that was a good one. This next example, again, this is something that happens on an annual basis, and it sounds really dry, doesn't it? We're talking Tarmac here. That's what asphalt is. So this is the umbrella organisation that represents tarmac manufacturers. But really, the story is about potholes, and it's one of those sort of classically British stories. It always does really, really well because everybody on BBC Regional Radio in particular has got a moan about a pothole down the road. But on Tuesday the 24th of March, we'd just gone into lockdown, and we were thinking, oh, is this the right thing to be doing? And so we normally say minimum of 10 to 12 interviews for a radio day, and get much more. But we got 13 interviews for this, but we got 2 mentions on the Today programme. So that was really, really fantastic, and shows that for certain stories there is still an appetite. And it's tricky because who knows when Boris Johnson's going to have a baby, or whether there's going to be a huge spike on a more serious note in coronavirus cases. So you take a chance to a certain point, but I would say that there is still opportunity there. And then this third one, for anybody working on perhaps on the tech side, this is a tech client of ours on Fido. They do facial recognition. It's really their thing, using artificial intelligence. And there wasn't a particular story other than a funding announcement, but we did manage to get some coverage for that. They started off it was people from Oxford University, so we got some regional TV coverage there, APTN and CNN. It was a bit heart in our mouths because CNN, they dropped the story, something to do with the pandemic, but we managed to get the coverage back again. So happy clients in the end. So I probably showed you those examples in order of ease, that it was OS, the Ordnance Survey, that appealed the most, followed by potholes, but potholes did come early in the pandemic, and then more challenging to do business stories. So some broadcasters have actually got have cut back or stopped some of their business programs, and so I think really it's the business ones that are the trickiest. And that brings me to the end. 45 minutes I've talked about, but if anybody's got any questions, I'm really happy to answer them. I'm just making sure I'm seeing everybody's chat. So if anybody's there, if you've want to share any of your successful stories, then do share away. If you've got stories that you're thinking about doing but you're not quite sure, throw them in the mix, and I'll try and answer them. But I would say funny, tricky, challenging times. But actually 6 weeks ago, I don't think I'd have predicted that we'd have got as much coverage for as many clients as we've actually seen. I'm not saying it's been easy. Well, it's never easy really in broadcast. I think it's always quite challenging because there's not that much airtime, particularly on nationals, and it's very competitive. But I think that those opportunities are there, and I would say that radio is more receptive to non-coronavirus stories than TV at the moment. But then there are more radio stations, and locally they're trying to provide a different agenda as well from national news. So unless something very specific to do with the pandemic is happening in a particular patch in the UK, then they're more likely to be interested in other stories. So I can see some people are there. Are you being shy, or would you like to say anything? I'll give you another minute. We're doing these webinars every 2 weeks. If you're on our mailing list, which I hope you are, then you'll get an update once a month telling you what we've got coming up for the next couple of months. If you're not on the mailing list and you'd like to be, then my email's there on the screen. You can email me and I'll make sure you get on the list. And if you look at our website, at the bottom menu, there's something called workshops, and we list all our events that are coming up. The other thing that we've got coming up is we have 3 times before done a pop-up radio studio, and we're doing that again on the 15th of May. And we're going to be talking about coronavirus. We've interviewed PR Week, PRCA. There's all sorts of things. Oh, so somebody has asked here, how would you go about building relationships with broadcast journalists? Do you mean in general, or do you mean now? Because I would say in general, for us, it started off with people that we used to work with, because most of us used to be broadcast journalists. And it's quite hard to get their time just because they're so sort of short of time themselves. But I suppose it's approaching them with a story. It's by understanding how the newsroom works, that it's going through planning, but that's only sort of one route to the door really. Other ways is sort of understanding the structure, I suppose, of a newsroom. So nationally, you know the people who are on air, but behind every person that is on air, there's a whole team of other people below that too. To build relationships with broadcast journalists now is really difficult, because as well as not having guests going into the broadcast studios, they're also not really having many staff. Some staff are going in, but it's very much a skeleton staff because they're doing social distancing when they get there, and the majority of broadcasters are working at home. So it is an email which quite often goes into a black hole, or already having their mobile numbers, that's not very helpful, is it, if you're thinking about starting it now? But yeah, sometimes by Twitter, but I think broadcast journalists are sort of less. I think that's more for print rather than broadcast journalists, but it's trying each and every way, really, isn't it? And I suppose once you've got in touch with a broadcaster, it's it's really making yourself useful to them, isn't it? That's really our strategy, I suppose. I like to just put everything on a plate so that they know without question that that's what you can film, that's who you can speak to, that's a case study who's going to illustrate it, and that's an explanation behind everything. And it's that compromise of some information, but not to overwhelm. Back to my point about the press release, that we don't really like to send out more than a page. Really, it's a taster, and if a journalist is really interested in broadcast, they'll then come back and ask you for more information. So hopefully that gives you a bit. There's possibly one more there. I'm not quite sure. Oh yeah, I think there's somebody messaging me privately. I'll come back to you there. So if you think of any other questions, or you just want to chat through a campaign, then we're really happy to do so. I've put our switchboard number up there, but actually it's diverted through to my mobile, so you might as well just call my mobile direct, and that's my mobile number there too. So our media relations team is working. Myself and my business partner Catherine are around too, and we're always happy to chat through things. I think unusual times, and sometimes we can do things a little bit differently in unusual times. So if there's no more questions, I'll say thanks very much for being a kind audience. Thank you for staying with me for the duration. Do join us again. I'm not sure who's doing our next webinar, but as I say, it will be in 2 weeks' time. I don't know how to stop the webinar, so you might have to bear with me for a second. But anyway, thank you for joining. Lovely to see you all, and hope to see you again.